Today's episode is brought to you by Epic Loot Store. One thing that unites the mythologies across almost all cultures is the presence of dragons and serpents. These creatures have been known to play pivotal roles in not just driving the narrative of a story forward, but also in their role in the belief of various religions. To the Greeks, for example, the dragons and serpents could often be seen as gods, including a water serpent known as the Hydra, which guarded the springs of Lerna, and the monstrous dragon Python, which was sent by Gaia to guard the oracle of Delphi. In traditional Christian beliefs, meanwhile, the serpent and the dragon were nefarious, with Lucifer taking the form of a dragon in his rebellion against God, as well as the serpent being responsible for the downfall of man, by convincing Adam and Eve to betray God. The ancient Norsemen fell into a similar vein in basing their dragons upon more corrupt virtues. This includes the dragon Fafnir, he who was something of a representation of greed, whose sole purpose became guarding a fortune of gold. But perhaps one of the most prolific serpents from the Norse pantheon was the world serpent, or the Midgard serpent, a monster so terrifyingly immense that it was believed to have encompassed the entire world. Its name was Jörmungandr, which was believed to have literally meant huge monster, and to the Old Norse, it was a beast that struck fear into not only the mortals, but also the gods themselves. I might also add that it would appear that there's a number of ways in which this creature's name is pronounced, and honestly, I think the greatest trick that Loki ever played at all was creating a child with such a complicated name. Most of what we know about Jörmungandr, or Jörmungandr as I've heard it pronounced, comes from the Prose Edda, which is considered to be the most detailed source of Norse mythology from Icelandic writer Snorri Sturluson. But the serpent is also seen to appear in various Skaldic and Eddic poems, as well as the ancient depictions of Jörmungandr fighting the Norse god of thunder, Thor. From what we understand, Jörmungandr was one of the three children of the trickster god Loki, along with his brother Fenrir, the monstrous wolf, and his sister Hel, the goddess of death. The three children certainly sound like powerful entities, but it would appear that all three were destined to meet terrible fates of their own. It was when Odin heard of a prophecy that Loki's children would bring trouble to the realm of the gods that he decided to get rid of them. Fenrir was revered from the very beginning, and having been noted for his terrifying size and strength, the gods expected him to do evil things. With that, he was bound by a magical chain and gagged by a sword. Hel, meanwhile, was exiled to the cold and miserable realm known as Niflheim, an area reserved for the souls of the dead, where she would become its governess. Jörmungandr was cast into the ocean by Odin himself, who had hoped that the crashing waves and chaotic churning of the waters would see to the serpent's demise. But Jörmungandr proved to be a resilient creature, and amongst the waters he was able to not only survive, but thrive. In these conditions, he grew so large that he was able to encapsulate the earth, and even grasp its own tail, thus earning its name as the World Serpent. It was believed that when the serpent released its tail, Ragnarok, the very same prophecy that Odin sought to avoid, would begin, and so would initiate a series of events that would lead to the demise of the gods. So it is said that when the end of days came about, Fenrir would break free from his bonds and unleash devastating fury upon those who had imprisoned him. Hel, his sister, would provide him with an army of the dead, for she too wished vengeance upon the gods for her exile, and Jörmungandr would release its tail from its mouth and decimate the gods and their heroes. Whilst the gods are victorious, many of them are slain by Loki's children, and whilst order is retained, the gods are ultimately reduced from their former glory and surrender to the transition of the new world, that which is built from the ashes of the old. Before we continue with today's episode, I'd like to introduce the sponsor of today's video, Epic Loot. Epic Loot make these really awesome jewelry pieces that are based on the historic symbols of Nordic culture. Whether you're into bracelets, rings, or even watches, there's more than a few eye-catching items to represent your inner Viking. Each piece is carefully crafted and made with such attention to detail that many of the designs look like they've been plucked directly from the Nordic sagas themselves. From runic symbols to the mythological elements, such as Fenrir, Mjolnir, and Odin's raven, each item tells a story that is infused with an enchanting feel. If you're a fan of dearest Jörmungandr, you might find a perfect match with the brand new Jörmungandr necklaces that Epic Loot have available, those that capture the sinister coiling of the serpent and also showcase his feeding of his own tail. These limited edition items are crafted from stainless steel and are both eye-catching and highly durable. You may also like the brand new 3D Dragon Journal, a hand-painted item composed of high-quality resin and acrylic. Not only is it great for taking notes in, but its spectacular design is a must-have for any would-be dragon hunter. There's so much to choose from over on epiclootshop.com, and I have no doubt that anyone who's a fan of Norse mythology will have no trouble finding some excellent items to enjoy. Right now, Epic Loot are offering free shipping on all items. Just click on the link in the description below and use the discount code EPICFS when you check out. And now back to Jörmungandr. Jörmungandr is believed today to be representative of transformation, or transition. The ancient symbol of Ouroboros, which stemmed from Greek and Egyptian iconography, depicts a serpent eating its own tail, much as Jörmungandr was considered to ingest its own tail as well. It was believed that this symbol stood for an eternal cycle, or a cycle of life, death, and rebirth, which is exactly what the tale of Ragnarok turned out to be. This is also typical of snakes in general, who shed their skin, and in a sense, are born a physical new. It's interesting to note that despite Odin being hated by Jörmungandr for having hurled him into the sea in the first place, it was Odin's son Thor who was usually depicted fighting the serpent, and it was Thor who was considered to be the serpent's greatest adversary. There are indeed many stories in which Thor encounters the serpent, and on each occasion, the two are at odds in some capacity. The first myth that springs to mind is the story of the Giant Stronghold, where Thor is travelling with both his human servant and the trickster god Loki. The trio come across the stronghold of the giants, and having been weary from the road, sought hospitality amongst the giants and access to their home. Instead of showing them kindness though, the king of the giants mocks the gods for being so tiny and tells them that if they wish to stay amongst them, they must demonstrate their worth in a series of competitions. Thor chooses the drinking contest, a challenge in which he felt pretty confident in. He is given a giant horn to drink from, and although he takes 3 massive gulps, he can barely drain the mead below the rim. When he cannot empty the giant horn, he is forced to admit defeat and suffer the laughter of all the other giants. But Thor demands another chance, and so the Giant King challenges him to lift his pet cat from the floor. Now Thor, who was known for his immense strength, saw no problem in such a meagre challenge. Yet when he tried to lift the cat, he was only able to get one of its paws off the ground. Frustrated and humiliated by failing both of these competitions, Thor demands to fight someone and proposes a wrestling match against the king's strongest fighter. But the king, who had already seen Thor fail twice, now deemed that Thor would be no match for his strongest fighter, and that the only person he had in his employ that was near enough Thor's strength was the castle's wet nurse, she who was an old and frail woman. Begrudgingly, Thor agrees to these terms, but when he wrestles the old woman, he is overpowered and forced to the floor in defeat. Despite having lost all 3 of the competitions, the giant feels sorry for Thor and his companions and decides to let them stay the night in his kingdom. The next morning, when leaving the castle, the king reveals to Thor that the tasks that they had competed in were not what they seemed. Instead, these tasks were manipulated by magic, which ensured that the gods were severely handicapped. First, the horn that Thor had drank from was connected to the ocean, and instead of drinking mead, Thor had actually been drinking from the ocean itself. Despite having only 3 large gulps from the horn, this was enough to significantly lower the sea levels. And secondly, the king's pet cat that Thor had failed to lift was actually Jörmungandr in disguise, and that Thor had nearly pulled the beast from the ocean, a feat that the king praised. And finally, the old woman who was said to have been the castle's wet nurse was actually the physical embodiment of old age, that which no one, not even Thor, could hope to defeat. Upon confessing his trickery, Thor is not amused and raises his hammer to strike the king. But using the same magic he had used to trick Thor, the giant king vanishes into thin air. There are some that believe that despite being present amongst these contests, Loki was actually the giant king himself, and that this was his attempt to not only humiliate Thor, but also to free his son Jörmungandr from the ocean. It would also make sense that Loki was behind this, given that he too appears to be tricked by the giant's challenges. For surely a trickster god like Loki himself would have realised the deceptions at hand. It would also have to take a god like Loki to have fooled Thor not just once, but 3 times. In any case, from that day forth, Thor swore vengeance on the giant king, as well as Jörmungandr, for having felt humiliated by the beast in his own failure to lift him. But unable to find the king ever again, on the account that this might have been Loki in disguise, Thor would focus his hatred upon Jörmungandr. Jörmungandr would appear to have developed a hatred for Thor as well, given that he was insulted that the god was arrogant enough to try and lift him from the ocean at all. Some believe that this was the basis for why Thor and Jörmungandr despised each other so much, and is why the two were depicted fighting each other so much in runes and ancient art. But Thor would not come upon Jörmungandr again until a story known as the Fishing Trip. In this story, Thor goes on an innocent enough fishing trip with the giant Hymir, but before long the two appear to be at odds. Hymir refuses to give Thor any bait to fish with, and so, in anger, Thor decapitates Hymir's favourite ox, and uses the ox head as bait instead. Not keen on getting on Thor's bad side, Hymir does not challenge the god for his affront, and instead tries to make the best of the trip by rowing to his favourite spot. There he catches several fish, and, content with his yield, wishes to return home. But Thor is not so content, and demands they go further out into the ocean, in the hopes that they come across the great Serpent. Despite dissuading Thor against this, Thor ignores Hymir and takes control of the boat for himself. Using the ox head as bait, he casts his line into the sea, and lo and behold, Jörmungandr takes the bait. In a chaotic struggle, Thor hauls the serpent from the sea, and the giant world serpent is revealed above the surface for all to see. Whilst Hymir trembles with fear and certain dread, Thor reaches for his hammer and attempts to draw the serpent closer. But so lost in his vengeance to slay the serpent, Thor fails to notice that as he draws the serpent closer to him, the boat threatens to capsize. Hymir, fearing for his life, cuts Thor's line, causing Thor to lose his balance. Jörmungandr, having now achieved the bait, dives beneath the surface and flees to fight another day. Enraged by Hymir's intervention, Thor struck the giant with such force it sent him flying overboard, forcing him to swim back to shore. In another version, Thor's temper is so fierce that he bludgeons Hymir with his hammer until the giant is dead. Thor had failed to find vengeance upon the Midgard serpent, but this would not be his final encounter with the sea creature. During the end times, those times that were promised to Odin that Ragnarok would be coming, the gods would come to realise their fate. It had been decreed to them that there was no avoiding this calamitous event, and though they knew they would die, they also knew that they would take their adversaries with them into the afterlife. In this, there was honour in death, but there was also the transition of the old world into the new, in spite of the desolation that would incur. When Ragnarok came, Fenrir would break free of his chain and would stride through the 9 realms, bringing destruction and ruin. His sons would swallow the sun and moon, leaving the world in darkness. Hel would provide Loki with an army of the dead, for which devastating battles were fought, and Surtur, as well as the other fire giants, would storm the battlefield and see to the world's annihilation by lighting the world fire. So it's only fitting that it is Ragnarok that sets the stage for the final battle between Thor and Jörmungandr, as the two meet again in an epic battle. The battle is frenzied and violent, but in the end, Thor is able to slay the serpent. However, he was also thought to have sustained multiple bites from the monster, which filled his veins with poison. Despite having exacted his revenge on Jörmungandr, Thor is only able to walk a few paces before succumbing to the poison, and dying as well. It's easy to see Jörmungandr as an evil essence, a villain of the Norse pantheon, much as his siblings are regarded. Yet Jörmungandr and his siblings are not necessarily representations of evil, but might even be justified for their actions. They are imprisoned by the gods, through no fault of their own, and it might be argued that they exact their vengeance not because of prophecy, but because of how Odin had treated them. Jörmungandr can be seen as a character of transformation, a positive feature of the narrative. Jörmungandr and his siblings might be depicted as violent creatures that threaten to overthrow the balance, but they can also be viewed as entities that challenge the status quo and destroy the old structure so a new one can be born. In this sense, Jörmungandr can be seen as a symbol of change, an essence that is inevitable, and a reminder that in life, nothing lasts forever. With this narrative, the serpent Jörmungandr serves to remind us that change or progress cannot be stopped, and even though we see Thor try to do so, which could be representative of our own efforts to prevent change, it is proven to be futile, both in the mythology and in reality. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.